And so all of those memories flooded back as well. So, you know, sitting with the joy of all of those people that I've worked with, but also everyone I've been talking to, it's been sitting with a flood of memories, with anger, with feeling justified in a lot of things, as well as the joy and the hope.
Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast for the foreign policy and global development communities and anyone who wants a deeper understanding of what is driving events in the world today. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg. I am a veteran international affairs journalist and the editor of UN Dispatch. Enjoy the show. As a journalist who covers international humanitarian crises, I'm accustomed to seeing masses of refugees fleeing their homes for safer locations. But in Syria, over the last several days, the reverse has happened. Thousands upon thousands of displaced people are now returning home. The scenes of traffic jams, literally on the road to Damascus, were truly moving and indicative of the fact that Syrians believe this new era will be one in which they are safe to return home. A brutal regime has been toppled, yes, but are the new de facto authorities going to respect the rights of Syrians, and are they able to undertake the basic functions of government to avoid state collapse and the chaos that would bring? I put these questions and many more to my guest today, Emma Beals, a longtime Syria analyst and reporter who is a senior advisor at the European Institute of Peace and a non-resident fellow at the Middle East Institute. We kick off discussing the mood on the street in Damascus before having a long discussion about Syria's political future. Over on the Global Dispatches newsletter, which you can access at globaldispatches.org or clicking the link in the show notes of this episode, I have been covering the Syria story from a UN angle. I published earlier this week a couple of pieces, including one that examines the changing dynamics at the Security Council that this new regime in Syria now brings, as well as some key takeaways from the UN Syria envoy's first press conference and what the UN Syria envoy's interpretation of political events on the ground suggests about the UN's ability to be a broker as this political transition gets underway in Damascus and the rest of Syria. You can access those pieces plus every episode of our new UN podcast, To Save Us from Hell, by going to globaldispatches.org and getting a paid subscription. We're in a bit of a fundraising push at the end of the year, and I hope to meet our goals, but we can't do that without you. Each individual subscription goes a very, very long way around here. We keep our overhead really low. That's one of the reasons I've been able to put out this podcast with such consistency over, now 12 years. But it does require a degree of listener support, and that's where you come in. So please go to globaldispatches.org and get a paid subscription. Thank you. Here is my conversation with Emma Beals. So, Emma, thank you so much for joining me. Look, I have been following your work on Syria for such a long time. I'm really excited to learn your perspective on what's happening. Just to kick off, I have to imagine that you have been just in constant contact with your friends, contact sources in Syria. Is there like a particular anecdote that someone has told you that you think is particularly illustrative of this moment?
There are really too many, to be honest, over the last few days, since kind of Sunday morning, where this became a reality, where Assad had left the country, where people started not to be afraid again. And some of the most profound things from me were people who have not been able to call me when they were inside of the country. They would have to leave to call me, or because I have a certain sort of profile, or what have you, just freely texting with me that they were happy that this was happening. And suddenly having those moments of realization of, oh, you can call me whenever you want. Let's just get on the phone and have a chat. And then also people that I've worked with for such a long time have done so undercover, have done so without their faces showing, without their full names, secretively, and doing a really important work, suddenly being able to use their name, put their photo, speak on camera to the media as this was happening. And just some of those little things that you don't even really think about when it's not you. And then just imagining how difficult that has been for folks to navigate. But yeah, just people that you've known for so long, seeing them able to just do things that you and I take for granted, use our full names and our pictures on our Twitter accounts and call our friends back home whenever we feel like it.
And just there's like joy I can sense in your voice, having been on the receiving end of these kind of calls that, after having existed under such a totalitarian system for so long, it's seemingly like emanating from your context to you, this kind of relief.
Well, not just emanating from them, but actually feeling it myself. As you mentioned, I've worked on Syria pretty much since the beginning. And this kind of work, you hold a lot of space for people's pain and people's suffering. You're talking to people all of the time. I've been investigating the Syrian detention system, the security state. I've been working with the families and survivor groups to try to find out what's happened to their loved ones. Having lost loved ones myself in Syria, some of these things are really personal. I've debated endlessly with officials about refugee return policy and peace process policy, and how much weight we should be giving to elements of security for Syrians or their sort of broader protection. And so it's not it's not personal. All of the things that we've seen come out over the last couple of days since that sort of very joyful part have just been, there's been this emotional roller coaster there where it's been this anger that all of this was true. Everything I was saying was true, and people didn't believe me, or thought me naive and idealistic, and were sort of prepared to send people back to risk these things. But even then, the joy for me, like of feeling like all of those hours of work were actually worth it. I went to a celebration on Sunday. Obviously, I saw a lot of people I knew who were just crying and hugging, but just seeing people who are in exile with children, suddenly with the weight of the world lifted off their shoulders, knowing they could go home and visit family if they wanted to, knowing their children can see the country that they're from, knowing that this intergenerational trauma has been lifted. And it's not very often that you get to see that in such a sort of dramatic way. Normally these changes are incremental in this sort of work. It's a tiny win, or it's the double negative, or whatever it is. You don't see the harm that wasn't done, that you prevented, or whatever. So you don't normally see that. And so not only was their joy infectious, but I felt an enormous amount of joy, enormous amount of relief, but also an enormous amount of grief. And before the moments of joy, there were those moments of seeing the names of these towns that were besieged, where we had been working with people who were living in extraordinary circumstances, where there were military campaigns, where we documented what had happened to people. And so all of those memories flooded back as well. So, sitting with the joy of all of those people that I've worked with, but also everyone I've been talking to, it's been sitting with a flood of memories, with anger, with feeling justified in a lot of things, as well as the joy and the hope.
I mean, for me at least, and I don't mean to make this like personal about us. This is not about us, and we'll move on in a minute. But for me, just as someone who kind of covers conflict and crises from afar, I'm used to seeing like streams of cars and people fleeing a conflict, and it was so moving to me, at least, to see just traffic jams of people trying to return home after having existed as refugees for so long. To me, at least, that's like the visual manifestation of a lot of what you discussed.
Yeah, and for me, it came in the inbox, hundreds of messages from people going, I'm going home, I'm going home. Or I've received videos of people who got home for the first time in years, crying and showing me the insides of their houses. And, all of those kinds of of things. Yeah, it's just normally the other way. They're normally crying when they pack everything up and leave and sort of are telling you they don't know where to go and what to do. So to see people reuniting with each other and with their places of origin and their homes and their special memories was, I can't even describe.
So I'm interested in getting your expert take on how this came to be. I mean, there had been this essentially like a status quo in northern Syria for many years that was seemingly and rather abruptly broken just over the last couple of weeks. And now, like the conventional wisdom, which I find compelling, and I'm curious to get your take, is essentially that the Assad regime was left exposed by the fact that Iran and Russia were distracted by Israel and by Ukraine, and then Hezbollah had been degraded. And in that context, HTS led this kind of improbable military campaign. I mean, it's probably too simplistic, but is that generally, broadly speaking, your interpretation of what happened?
I mean, that is certainly one big part of it, because if you remember the previous military campaigns, air power played a huge role. Hezbollah did some of the most brutal sieges. Russia flew the planes and was doing a lot of the air power. And that had an enormous impact on the military campaigns and ability to take and hold territory. But it's not the whole story. And I think that it's a mistake to think that it is. A lot of us have been warning that a frozen conflict is not peace. The levels of violence have been ticking up gradually over the last wee while. But I think what's also important is the regime has not offered any kind of peace dividend or sensible form of governance in their areas. And so people talk about, the fact that the army kind of gave up their positions, and they did. People did not want to fight. They were defecting or withdrawing quite rapidly, which is partly how HTS took so much territory so quickly and with so little fighting, really, for what was a military campaign. But also communities did as well. So, there were notables negotiating with HTS to sort of say, yeah, come through, we won't fight you. And those weren't necessarily decisions taken, on the military side, but the community side as well. What you have to understand is the regime, a lot of the fighting around Damascus and in their areas had finished in 2016 or 2018, and people expected some sort of benefit for their children having, fought for the Syrian army and believed all of the things about Assad being the only form of stability. But instead, what he did is continue to have a corrupt, kleptocratic, highly securitized dictatorship. And people would see their young men being arrested. They would see the contracts going to the regime cronies. You had an economic shock. You had COVID, where they didn't really go and help anyone. After the earthquake, they were terrible at helping anybody. And so you had these schisms in Syrian society. And what we've seen with the coast and with Damascus as well is these supposedly stronghold areas where Assad was said to have had all this broad support just weren't really interested in him sticking around either. So it was a combination of those big geopolitical events, Russia and Iran being tied up elsewhere, but also all of these really interesting dynamics within Syria itself as well.
So now we have this really very fascinating, very fluid moment of transition in Damascus, in which you have HTS seemingly working in partnership, at least to some degree, with remnants of the old regime. How would you describe like the political situation in Damascus right now?
I mean, it's astonishing would be the first word that I would use. To see this photo that I first saw yesterday of the Minister of Justice of the old regime and the Minister of Justice of what's called the Salvation Government, which is the kind of administrative function of HTS, sat down to talk about continuity of the work plan. And the Prime Minister, the reason everyone learned that Assad had left the country and that all of this was happening was the Prime Minister had got on the television on Sunday sort of saying it's all over and I will facilitate a peaceful transition of power. And he has done that. You've had this, the leader of HTS and the Prime Minister sitting down discussing how things will be transferred, which ministers are going to go where, reassuring everyone to go back to their jobs and government agencies and the governorates and the local administration and continue to sort of make everything function. There's been this huge amount of cooperation. If you'd asked me if that was possible that quickly and that deeply, 2 weeks ago, I would have told you probably that you're a bit mad. So it's been really surprising to see. But I think it also speaks to the fact that, at a fundamental level, everyone is exhausted, and actually ensuring that there isn't a whole lot more fighting, that there isn't state collapse, that there isn't a lack of food and electricity and water and house supplies. It's actually really important to people after 14 years of conflict, and they seem to be doing a relatively good job of making sure that happens.
Yeah, so we're speaking on Tuesday, December 10th. Earlier in the day in Geneva, the UN Special Envoy for Syria, Geir Peterson, gave a press conference, and he said something very interesting, just to your point just now. He was asked a question about, like, how do you balance the need for justice for this horribly totalitarian, authoritarian regime that did all sorts of horrible human rights violations, trampled on people's human rights? How do you assure justice for the victims of the Assad regime's crimes while at the same time ensuring a continuity of government so that basic government services are still able to function? And he didn't like give an answer, but he said that is something that the Syrian people are going to need to figure out in the coming days and weeks.
Yeah, and that's going to be a real challenge because, sort of coming back, to the Minister of Justice point for a second, at the same time as that meeting was happening, you had people digging under Sydnaya prison to try to find the last of the prisoners there in the most awful of prisons.
Can you just explain that? Because for people who are not familiar, there were basically rumors that were being spread that there are like secret dungeons underneath the prisons and people are desperately searching for their loved ones by digging under the prison themselves.
That's right. So there's Sydnaya. There's also secret prisons, which are hidden all over the place that everybody's running around to try to find at the moment. But yeah, there was these rumors going around with Sydnaya because it was a bit of a rabbit warren. Some of the doors were hidden. The doors to the red areas, what's called the red section, were actually hidden because the doors had been locked with some sort of digital code before the guards had left. Even in the relatively high up levels, they had to smash locks off. They'd had to smash through concrete walls to let people out. They'd sort of heard voices through walls and had to knock through them. So it wasn't inconceivable that there were hidden elements of this. And I've also heard from a couple of people that there were former prisoners who had been deeply mentally affected by their experiences, who were sort of maybe a little bit confused about what had happened when they were underground and were wanting to help and desperately wanting to rescue these other people, but were giving information that perhaps was not leading anywhere as to where people could be found. The other really heartbreaking part of why everyone wanted to keep looking is there's well over 100,000 people missing, and there were a few tens of thousands of prisoners released in all of the prisons that they had found by this point, which included most of the major prisons. And so, at the real heart of it is not whether there were 3 floors of prisoners underneath with 100,000 people, because, some could be seen on a CCTV. It was the fact that there were still over 100,000 people unaccounted for, and those families desperately wanted them. And so believing that there were 3, 4, 5, 10 floors underneath where these people might be allowed them to hold on to that hope just a few hours longer. And ultimately, that hope wasn't realized.
So, one of the key questions going forward that you hear kind of bandied about, at least in Western punditry, is whether or not HTS is indeed committed to an inclusive future for Syria, or whether they are just saying the right things right now in order to secure delisting from a terrorist list and in order to essentially make themselves more palatable to the international community. Do you have a sense, based on what you've heard from your contacts, your colleagues inside Syria, of what HTS's true agenda is right now and whether or not that their professed commitments to inclusiveness are actually meeting with realities on the ground of how they're conducting themselves in Damascus and other places that they've liberated?
So I think we need to divide the question into two. One is what they are doing in terms of including minorities, as they've gone through the country and taken over different areas or negotiated with all sorts of different sects and religions and so on as they've gone through. Has that been genuine? Are people seemingly protected? Yes, and that has been the case for some time. So when people ask about, is his transformation real? It is genuine. You can see that they are disciplined, that there is the ability to govern, to negotiate, to be pragmatic. It's not pushing necessarily front and center the ideological line. It's sort of saying Syria for Syrians, let's sort of, have this transition of power. Christians, you can go to church. We're going to sign some documents over here with the Alawite community, and all of these sort of big fears that people had about, horrible revenge and all of these things. Yes, they may come later. They have not come yet. And so we need to keep watching and waiting. The second part for me is they've talked about inclusivity within that sort of small sphere, right? Are we going to harm minorities? Is everyone going to be able to sort of live side by side? That's one part of it. The second part is, are they looking to rule in a way that would meet all of the legitimate aspirations of the Syrian people who rose up in 2014 asking for democracy and freedom and human rights and all of these other things? And I think that's a slightly different question. And on that count, things remain to be seen a little bit more with regard to a transitionary government, whether that's going to be an inclusive, sort of democratic, pluralistic approach to governance, rather than sort of protecting minorities, which I think are two slightly different things. Are we going to have democratic elections that sort of fit within the aspirations that folks may have? And so I think on the latter part, there's a lot that we still don't know. And Syrian civil society and leaders are really starting to sort of try to work out what that part means.
Yeah, I mean, these are still very early days in terms of whether or not there will be a legitimate democratic transition within Syria, or at least whether early actions taken over the next few weeks may lead to a legitimate democratic transition. To that end, though, are there any intermediate steps that you're looking towards that will suggest to you whether or not there is this commitment to a democratic transition?
Well, I think the most obvious one would be, are they going to pitch up in Geneva to, UN-led talks under the auspices of 2254?
Can you explain what that means for listeners who are not aware?
So there were various attempts to create a peace process in Syria over the last 14 long years. Those started in Geneva. In 2015, there was a UN resolution signed, which has been the framework for the peace process up until this point. Obviously, nearly 9 years later, we were no closer to peace through that process. It sort of, broadly speaking, talks about a transitional government under which there would be a discussion about a new constitution that everyone feels happy about, that the transitional government would be inclusive, there'd be this constitution, there'd be elections, there'd be the creation of a calm, safe and neutral environment in the country that addresses things like refugee return and housing, land and property and all of the basic issues that were both conflict drivers and were exacerbated. So in that process, there was sort of named the government and also the political opposition, which is a very sort of particularly defined group. Whether or not things happen specifically under that framework, or whether there is, those elements are brought to bear through some other framework, through negotiation with HTS, through Syrians discussing it amongst themselves, through national dialogues, through pressure from various countries, that part is sort of still to be defined. But I think that if they do not at least sort of engage with the principles and spirit of 2254 and those aspirations, they will find it difficult to govern long term, because for so many Syrians, they have skin in the game. Either they were detained, they were exiled, they've been separated from families, they've lost properties, they've lived in, they've all got skin in the game, even if they were not fighting. And so they will be expecting some sort of process that has a kind of inclusive transitional governance process where they have some sort of stake in what that looks like, and where all those aspirations and sacrifices are recognized and implemented in some way. Remains to be seen.
So that'll be actually interesting to see whether or not HTS or some new configuration of HTS. So there's word that they might disband and rename themselves so as to avoid that terrorist designation that had been conferred on them by both the United States and the United Nations. That if they participate in this 2254 Security Council resolution process, that's a good sign. Lastly, what, broadly speaking, positive, productive role might the international community play right now to help Syria transition itself in a peaceful way?
Well, I think number one is to sort of pull back a little on the individual interests.
Yeah.
There's been a lot of states involved in Syria for a very long time. We've seen fighting in the northeast between some of the SNA, the Turkish-backed forces in particular, and the Kurdish forces in the northeast. So that's going on at the moment. Then also we have Israel with large numbers of airstrikes overnight and incursion around the Golan Heights to try to degrade particularly sites that they believed had chemical weapons or large weapon stockpiles to make sure that those didn't fall into various actors' hands, but also to create a buffer zone around the Golan to make sure that their concerns are addressed. But it is having a significantly negative effect on public opinion, on people's fears, right, to hear airstrikes again after all of everything that has happened. So those kinds of like actual active conflict elements, and going along with that, big demands from states around what should or should not happen in a UN process, who should or should not be included, and, really sort of like leading with their own interests or continuing to do it in that way and define heavily what this looks like from their own perspective, I think also particularly unhelpful. There needs to be a huge surge of humanitarian support. There needs to be a lot of engagement with HTS because HTS have been governing the Northwest with very, very little international engagement for a long time. And they're sort of now in charge. So that needs to be a relationship building process. But also, I would be hoping to see not making the mistakes of some other places, and those mistakes go in all directions, right? In some places it's maintain, terrorism designations, keep completely hands off, make everything terrible with what can and can't get in terms of financing and aid because there is a very unreformed actor. Obviously, that approach would be very difficult across Syria, but may be warranted depending on what we see from HTS. I don't think it's necessarily warranted at the moment. Or on the flip side, being overly conciliatory, sort of, immediately saying, okay, well, the Christian community are living happily over there and the Alawites seem to be all right over there. Never mind about democracy or engagement with the rest of civil society. You've countered Iran and Captagon is gone. And so we were all happy. Good luck to you all. We're going to delist you. We're going to give you all the reconstruction money and come what may, which would make a lot of people really unhappy. So it needs to be a very considered approach. It needs to sort of, try to build those relationships, see what we see from HTS, like really observe carefully the way that they're acting, signal the kinds of things that would be productive, support the civil society efforts of Syrians, talking to Syrians about what it is that they want, make sure that that is happening, and sort of take a bit of a lead from them and try not to interfere as much as possible, while also offering the appropriate amounts of support or leverage as necessary to go along to facilitate that process. Very, very delicate balance. Lots could go wrong. I think we're all really holding our breaths and hoping among hope that it goes in the right direction for all those who have suffered for so long.
Well, you and me both, Emma. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to Global Dispatches. The show is produced by me, Mark Leon Goldberg. It is edited and mixed by Levi Sharp. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, make sure to follow the show and enable automatic downloads to get new episodes as soon as they're released. On Spotify, tap the bell icon to get a notification when we publish new episodes. And of course, please visit globaldispatches.org to get on our free mailing list, get in touch with me, and access our full archive. Thank you.